Hi, I'm James from Chaosium. I sat down with David Larkins, who is the line editor for Pendragon, and we talked about generic fantasy versus genre fantasy. This is sort of an expansion on a video with Jeff Richard on what is fantasy more broadly, but it's also a look at how Pendragon deals with fantasy stories a little differently from the norm. I started off the interview by asking David to define what generic and genre fantasy is. I'll jump across to the interview in just a moment, but first, please subscribe to our channel. It really helps us out. Thanks.
So I came across this distinction many years ago, poking around on Greg Stafford's old website, which is no longer extant, but he had an essay up there that basically defined the two terms, genre fantasy and generic fantasy. And it's a very short little essay that he wrote about it, but it really illuminated me. It really cracked my brain open because it was a way of distinguishing these two different threads of what we call fantasy into sort of two camps that he's really not trying to put one above the other. I think there can sometimes be a negative connotation with generic. Oh, it's a very generic term or whatever, but he's just using it as a label, as a convenient label.
Fantastic. So why does creating this distinction help you when you're diving into a fantasy story, when you're trying to explore a fantasy tabletop role-playing game?
Primarily, it helps because, well, first of all, everyone needs to have, if you're in a fantasy role-playing game, everyone needs to have a common understanding of what you're looking for. So, for example, when I first started running Pendragon, some of my players who had never played it before were initially advocating to get into all kinds of different hijinks, like they wanted to go to Romania and hunt vampires, like that kind of thing, right? Which is cool. Knights hunting vampires in a medieval setting, very cool. I'm into it. Just not in Pendragon, because Pendragon is, as Greg talks about in the essay, Pendragon is one of the exemplars of this genre fantasy, where the point is the excitement comes from operating within the conventions or the tropes set down by that genre.
So let's talk about generic fantasy to start with a little bit, because that might be something that's more familiar to everybody. It doesn't sound like you're saying generic is bad, even though the word might come with a little bit of baggage.
Correct. Yeah, exactly. What he means by generic fantasy in his essay is he's just saying this is the blender approach. This is the wild mishmash where you can have knights hunting vampires, and maybe you want to throw in Stormbringer into the mix as well because you like the Elric stories. It's essentially an unfettered imaginative space that you can really get into, a bit like in your interview with Jeff, where you talked about what is fantasy, and that really opened it up, right? Like fantasy can be all kinds of different things. I mean, it doesn't have to be just one definition. And generic fantasy is that's what you were talking about, essentially. You were saying like, hey, let's go wild with this. Let's have some fun. Bring in whatever we want. Greg actually compared it to, he said it's a very American take on fantasy, which, is certainly a way to look at it, but it is kind of like if you look at that from the sense of like America being one of the places in the world where a lot of folks from different cultures have come together and brought a lot of different influences together to create something unique culturally. That's what he's talking about, right? So it's that sort of open imaginative space, and it can be very exciting because it's like anything goes.
It's like a composite of different kinds of fantasy. Would I be wrong in saying that several of the biggest settings and tabletop role-playing games, Dungeons and Dragons, for example, tend to work within that space where it's free and you can pull in from all kinds of different resources and create the game you want?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I think that's one of the core appeals of D&D and other generic fantasy. Again, I'm not trying to put it down. I'm just saying this is a wide open field, right? And you can bring anything in. I mean, you look at some of the more recent D&D products like Spelljammer, for example, which literally has killer clowns from outer space in it. I mean, that's pretty fun.
So flipping things around a little bit, turning now towards genre fantasy. At surface value, somebody might say, well, you've introduced to me this style of play where I can bring in anything and I can do all these exciting things. Why would I want to restrict everything?
So this gets into, now, not to spoil the ending, but I do prefer genre fantasy over generic fantasy if I were to be given the choice between the two. I do like my generic fantasy explorations. It's totally fun. But at the end of the day, if I had to pick one or the other, I mean, obviously, Pendragon's a genre fantasy game. That's kind of where I'm coming from. But to me, what's exciting about genre fantasy is that it's encouraging you to really inhabit that world, because it's providing these very prescribed, sometimes even rigid ideas about what makes, say, Arthurian fantasy different from the mythic fantasy of RuneQuest, for example. I mean, even Call of Cthulhu is a genre fantasy take on horror, right? Because in Call of Cthulhu, you're not usually going to have the monster mash kind of situation where you got a werewolf one week and you got Dracula the next week and that kind of thing. There's usually these sort of mythos tropes that you're operating within in a Call of Cthulhu game, that certain things you expect certain things to happen in Call of Cthulhu that you might not expect in another horror RPG, right? So it's partly that it's like it does what it says on the tin, right? It's like you kind of know what to expect coming in and you can get excited about that. And then it's almost like rules are made to be broken. So once you're operating within this confined space, then it's like, how are you deviating from that? Or where are you bumping up against those boundaries? So like in Arthurian fantasy, like what's really exciting is seeing how much your knight can live up to the ideals of chivalry and honor, or how far they might fall. It's these explorations of these spaces. And it really, to my mind, generic fantasy is very broad, which is fun, but genre fantasy I find to be deeper. It really allows a much deeper exploration of characters and of the world.
You mentioned that Pendragon is an excellent example of genre fantasy at work. Can you talk us through the way that genre fantasy appears within Pendragon? Give us an example of best practices.
Well, first and foremost, it's one of the most notable things about the game, which is that in the core rules, everybody plays a knight. And that right away tells you something, because you are not dealing with a situation where it's like, well, I'm going to play a knight, you're going to play a thief, you're going to play a wizard. It's like we are all of this one type. We are all knights. We belong to the noble class, the ruling aristocracy. We have certain rights and expectations that are put on us by that position in society. We have certain things that we are expected to live up to legally, morally, etc. Certain conventions like the game of courtly love that nobody else in this setting is playing. Peasants aren't being sending each other little secret messages, in between harvest time or whatever. So right away, you're creating that very narrow limit. Like you are all knights. From that point forward, then that then dictates, like I said, certain expectations. So, for example, honor is very important. Glory, acquisition of glory is very important. It defines these very narrow targets that you're aiming for, which then drives a very specific gameplay experience, because you don't have 5 players all going off in different directions. Every knight at that table wants honor and they want glory. They're going to do what they can to get it. Now, there are different ways to get glory. You can defeat monsters, you can win tournaments, you can accomplish great deeds in front of your liege lord, things of that nature. You can marry well, you can get rich. These are things that will bring you glory. So you can absolutely sort of decide which specific path you're going to take. But yeah, everybody who plays Pendragon comes away with the same comment, which is like, this is a very immersive game, and it's because of that basic setup, like right from the start.
So would you say that one of the main benefits crystallized is that it gets everybody on the same page? It establishes a basic narrative structure for the adventure as a whole. And of course, you can break out from that, but it also shows more clearly when you are trying to break away from the traditional structure unless you understand the flow of the narrative better.
That's exactly it. Yeah.
So when we are talking about practical advice we can take from this, if you're going to be diving into a game of Pendragon, or a game that when you look at it, you think it would benefit from applying some of the genre fantasy rules, locking the narrative down a little bit, what's some advice you have for GMs or for players to make their experience more interesting?
Well, really, yeah, I mean, and that's the thing, you can apply genre fantasy tropes to any kind of fantasy game experience, including D&D, right? Even before I discovered Pendragon, I kind of liked my D&D to be a bit more grounded, low magic, maybe feel a little bit more historical, even if it was a fantasy world. So that's one way to do it, is you kind of decide, you set up some limits. You say, okay, well, for example, maybe this time around, you're all gonna play elves. We're gonna really explore what it is to be an elf in the Forgotten Realms or whatever. And you just really dial down on that and decide, like, what are some tropes of like an elf campaign, and whether you want it to be something that's kind of like classic conception of an elf. You're in the woods, you're the stewards of the woods, you're fighting orcs who are trying to invade, whatever. Or you could like do something different, but essentially you're defining terms, you're defining ideas, you're setting limits on what kind of characters people can make, you're setting limits on for yourself on things like magic, like how common is magic, what sort of magic items are they going to be finding in this campaign, how often are they going to be finding magic items, be another one. As you're doing that, you're essentially creating, you might be emulating or creating your own genre. I mean, like if you're setting your game in Middle Earth, that's a genre fantasy exercise right there, because there's some very strong genre elements that distinguish Middle Earth from other generic fantasy tropes that might have elves, orcs, and halflings and that kind of thing, but it's not Middle Earth. So what makes it Middle Earth? Do some reading, take some notes, see if you can identify key tropes that appear over and over again.
Do you have any advice for going in the other direction? Is there a time when you really want to lean into the free form and the wide generic fantasy? How can you do that well?
Well, that's another reason I actually like genre fantasies, because it's actually easier to expand it out from your starting point than it is to sort of tell people they can't do things, or like, oh, you can only make these types of characters or whatever. If that's like the understanding from the start, then it's easier to expand out from there. And Pendragon kind of goes through similar design cycles where we like to present the core knight experience in the core books, and then supplements will come out where it's like, oh, well, if you want to play noble women, or you want to play a magician, or some other type of character who's sort of allied to the knights, here's some rules for making those types of characters, and you can fold those into your campaign as you go along. Past editions of Pendragon have even had like, hey, you can play Bronze Age Celts, or you can play Norsemen, or you can play Saxons, you can play the bad guy. So, but those are options. You don't have to have those in your game, but it's pretty easy to add, honestly, because all you have to do is just, the next time somebody's rolling up a new character in the campaign, you say, hey, you want to make a Saxon this time, or or a magician, or do you want to create a magician as a backup character who shows up from time to time, and you're still playing your knight primarily, but your magician will come around from time to time to throw some curveballs at the rest of the party, being magicians and all. So yeah, it's relatively easy. You can really go for broke. You could have a big plague that comes in and causes a great mortality, or you can even have, like, if you really want to go for it, just have a UFO land in the middle of Camelot. Like, and now suddenly you're really playing a generic fantasy game.
UFO in the middle of Camelot is a hell of an idea. I hope you're teasing some of the upcoming books in the line. Do you have any final thoughts? Anything we didn't touch on that you want to go over?
Yeah, I mean, I would just say that I just want to reiterate what Greg said, which is there really isn't one version of fantasy that's better than the other. It really is a spectrum. I mean, that's actually how I would look at it. I mean, Greg kind of made it didactic, like two different versions of fantasy. To me, it's more of a spectrum, and where you're sliding your place along that spectrum. You could go all the way to generic, all the way to genre. But I think a lot of people, honestly, probably end up somewhere in the middle, because sometimes you like to create those limits, but then other times you really want to, bust out and go wild.